Welcome to the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. Each week, we talk with accomplished content strategy experts to share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 12 of the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. I'm really happy today to have on the show Melanie Seibert. She's a content strategist at WillowTree, which is a mobile-focused agency in, I think, are you in Charlottesville, Melanie?
I am, Charlottesville, Virginia. Yep.
Yeah. And can you tell me a little bit more about your role there at WillowTree and exactly what that entails?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, we're an agency that's focused on mobile apps. We do a lot of apps. We also do websites, but recently we've been branching out into other digital products like chatbots. But historically, mobile apps has been our focus. And I work in a UX design team of supporting about, I think we're up to around 15 designers now on different projects. So I help with content design and content strategy for all of our client projects.
Nice. And the reason I wanted to invite you on the show is I think in one of those content strategy groups on Facebook, you said, and I'll just read this quote that I pulled out that led to me reaching out to you. You said, "I'm puzzled why content touch points in native mobile apps don't seem to get much interest in our industry." And that just really intrigued me because to me, the fields of content strategy and mobile apps kind of arose at a very similar time, and yet they haven't melded yet. Tell me more about that. Yeah, tell me more about that question and your concern there.
Yeah, that's a good point that you make. So I guess, it comes from a little bit from my experience. So when I started here, I had worked on websites as a content strategist for a few years, and I started talking to my boss, and he said, "Well, have you ever worked on push notifications?" And I was like, no, my mind was kind of blown by that because it had never even occurred to me that a content strategist would work on push notifications for an app. And he said, "Okay, well, have you ever worked on an app store listing?" And I was like, no, he said, "Well, there's an entire search ecosystem that is specific to the app stores that, is separate from Google. So we think about SEO for Google and Bing, but we don't think about, they call it ASO, which is App Store Optimization for apps." And it kind of opened up a whole new world where I was like, I've never heard of these things before. And are there content strategists out there working on this and talking about this? And so I started sort of asking around, poking around, and there are marketers talking about it. With any search type of conversation, there's always going to be people wanting to game the system, and you can find that stuff online, but there weren't very many UX or product focused people who were talking about those content touch points. So I actually submitted a talk to Confab last year, and I was lucky to get in, and I was able to talk about it there. So that was really fun. But other than that, I've been really kind of surprised that I'm sort of putting like hooks out there in like our forums, and you mentioned the Facebook group and just different places where people like us hang out and talk about content strategy. And I haven't really seen a ton of interest. A lot of people are talking about omni-channel content. So, how to make your content fit various channels, including apps. But it may just be that there's less awareness of native mobile specific content touch points like the ones that, push notifications and App Store and those types of things.
Right. That's so interesting to me because I think of yesterday I was talking to a buddy who's a Drupal developer at an agency, and we were somehow got on the subject of their social, their CMS has fields for every social media outlet, and with specific image sizes and kind of style guides for the content for each social media message. And it just seems like that what you were just talking about, I'd never heard that term ASO before. So that's it, because I've done a lot of SEO, so I totally get the concept there. But anyhow, it seems like, do you the first thing I'll ask you about that is, internally there at WillowTree, as you're developing, do you have something like a CMS that drives your mobile apps?
Yeah, so it's interesting you say that. I actually wasn't aware of any CMS that that drives content to social as well as products. So I'd love to hear more about that. But we have worked with CMSs. One that we've worked with quite a bit is Contentful. So Contentful is a headless CMS. There are a few of them out there that are, similar, where they don't have the sort of publication layer. It's mainly just a database for your content. And then you have to build the front end from scratch to hook into that. It actually serves up content through an API. So your front end is built to hook into that API and pull out the content. So of course the content is able to go into any channel where you have integrated that API, including apps and websites. And it's been really cool to be able to work on projects where we can do that. But as far as like push notifications and those types of specific, it's almost like they're kind of in a no man's land between product and marketing. I've thought about this so much and asked around, and it's like, I don't really see consensus on like why are we not talking about it? Are we thinking it's marketing's job, and is marketing thinking it's product's job? And, it's like, it falls in between. And, I haven't seen that content managed in an omni-channel ecosystem, like with a headless content management system. There are specific, kind of like email, there's specific software that we use to send those messages. So as far as tools go, I haven't seen the integration between product, content in the CMS and like notifications content in the publication tools that we use for that. And there are several. The one that we use is called Urban Airship, and it's a pretty sophisticated tool for sending push notifications and also other messages related to native apps. Okay. And when I talk about native apps, just to make sure everybody, it makes sense to everyone, I'm specifically thinking about iOS and Android apps.
Okay, that's what I assume, and I realize that we're getting a little ivory tower lingo-y here. I'm just going to quickly describe. So a headless CMS, for people who don't know, and Melanie, you kind of alluded to it, but it's basically like the back end of a content management system where you have all the structured data and everything is in there, but you don't necessarily, it doesn't have built into it the front end publishing system that most CMSs have, and I think it's really common, and a lot of like well-established CMSs like WordPress now, which I'm pretty involved in, they, with the introduction of API endpoints in there, it's pretty much can function as a headless CMS, and a lot of people are using it that way. Same thing with Drupal or lots of other CMSs. The other term, there was another term that you used, and like you just said, the native mobile apps, and talking specifically about the two main platforms, Android and iOS. And the first thing I do after we record this is go through and take show notes, and I will define for folks in the show notes any of the lingo we've brought up. But that's something you said just a second ago about the disconnect between the content folks and the product folks. I mean the marketing folks and the product folks in regards to this type of content. How much, because you define, you're on the product side, right? You're a product content strategist embedded in the UX team, it sounds like there. Mm-hmm. So how are you kind of proactively, this is like kind of grabbing, pulling the information you need from the marketing folks, or how do you manage that internally, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, we just basically, so it's really interesting because this has led me to do a lot of thinking and reading on the distinction between product and marketing. And the more I'm kind of thinking about it and reading about it, I'm seeing there's, it's not a wall like we kind of have in some organizations. To the user, their experience is with both, the marketing touch points and then the product. So to them, it's just one experience over time. But to us, we kind of like silo it off, or at least in my mind in the past, it's been kind of siloed off into marketing and product. So what we do here, we have a really robust strategy process, and I'm talking now about product strategy, which is a little bit, we think about that as a little bit different than content strategy here. So when clients come to us for product strategy, we're thinking that team is tasked with figuring out, okay, what makes sense for your business? What products make sense for your business, and what products make sense in the marketplace? So they do competitive landscape. and a ton of user research and determining what people are looking for and interested in having as a product. And when they're doing that, it's all encompassing. So they'll often make recommendations about content too, and they pull me in on that as well. So we collaborate. But a lot of times when they're recommending something to a client, they'll say, well, it'd be really great if your app did this, and also there should be a push notification to tell the user X, Y, or Z. So that content is such an integral part of the product that it's a part of the product strategy as well as design. So even though I think out in the world, a lot of people think of those types of channels as marketing channels, it's all kind of one and the same to me now.
Right, that one, and just one of the many. I can think of a bunch of interactions and considerations between those two. But one of the kind of top level things that applies there is branding. And in your product development, are you developing brand along with the product, or is it you're sort of inheriting the brand from the? I don't know what kind of apps exactly you're doing, but does that make sense? And how do you and does that help guide your styles and things like that as you?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It actually just depends on the client. So we get clients who have very well-developed branding. So for example, you probably saw on our website, we work with Regal Cinemas and Wyndham Hotels. Mm-hmm. They have very distinctive branding that they've developed. But then we also work with clients who maybe are new startups or new companies that are just launching. And if that hasn't been decided yet, we'll definitely, come in and help. And we have designers and strategists and people with expertise to sort of advise in that area. It's probably not our main area of focus, but it's definitely something that we take into consideration, because our goal is, we have this saying here, and I'm not sure if it comes from someplace else. It probably does, where we want to be doctors, not waiters. So rather than being told, please deliver this to us by X date, that may start the conversation, but then we always want to be thinking about, okay, well, what's really going to help this client and what's really going to help their audience? And that often goes into branding and even like marketing recommendations and stuff like that.
Right. So actually, a little bit more about WillowTree then. How big you mentioned there's about 15 people on the design team, I think. How big an outfit is WillowTree altogether?
I think now we're at about, I've lost count. I think we're close to 200 now.
Wow.
We have offices. Our main office is here in Charlottesville, and then we also have a Durham office. But despite the fact that we're not in any major American city like Silicon Valley, we're growing quite a bit, and we do have some really exciting clients and projects. So it's a little bit tough to keep track of how many people we have because we're constantly adding.
Got it. Yeah, and I love that doctors, not waiters. That's a great way to look at it. And it gives you an established. I can picture that being a great way to interact with folks. Now let me go back just a little bit to the kinds of native apps that you do. Like if you do something for you mentioned I think Regal Cinemas. Do you do so the apps you've done for a client like that? Is there kind of a standard suite of content that comes with a mobile app? Do you sort of have standard operating procedures, or do you have a lot of individualization and customization that goes into each client project?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's more customized. Maybe over time, it'd be great to get to a point where we have a standard operating procedure, and I could make a checklist or something to sort of help with that process. But every client is so different. We have clients in media, and so they have an editorial staff, and they don't necessarily need help with the content that is their main product, but they need help with integrating the mobile specific touch points with that. So push and app store and things other things that we could get into. But so it's very custom to the client. But there are certain touch points that I do try to think about for every project. So in the confab talk, I talked about 4 specific ones. App indexing, which is kind of a pet topic of mine that I just think is really interesting, where normally, or in the past, app content, the content that's inside the app, would be siloed off from the web. So for Regal Cinemas, as an example, you would have like movie listings. And in the past, those movie listings in the app would be separate from a Google search. So you'd go to Google and search for a movie in your town, and you wouldn't see those listings from the app. But with app indexing, we can actually make the content within the app available to a general Google search. So if you have the app installed on your phone and you do the search on your, let's say Google, on your Chrome app on your phone or what have you, then in the search results, you can go directly to the app. So that's a very sort of like in the weeds example, but that's one thing that I just think is really neat and cool that we can do that I had no idea about before I came here. And then I talk about product content, which is that omni-channel content that we talked about earlier, where you're dealing with the content management system. And that's typically the content like form fields, error messages, and other content inside the app itself. And then push notifications, which today it's more than just push. There are several different notification types that are involved with apps. So we can do, I don't know how in detail I should get here, but there are just a lot of different ways to message people around your app. So even if they have push turned off, which a lot of us do if it's not done well, and we don't advise people to do it poorly, obviously, but some people are just not going to enable push on their phones. You can still message people within the app. And so we talked about that. And then the last one was the App Store that I mentioned earlier. So those are 4 that I try to think about for every client. And sometimes they've already thought about it and they have a plan, and sometimes they don't. So it just depends.
Yeah, interesting. And do you have sort of internally, so each app is a distinct application, obviously. Do you have sort of a development platform or a how do you I assume you have some internal procedures and things that account for all this stuff you were just talking about.
Yeah, some of it depends on the client's existing tool set. So some clients, have tools in place that they want to use. So I mentioned, for push messaging, there's Urban Airship. You can use Exact Target. And some clients you have familiarity with, we've used Exact Target for email, so we want to use it for push notifications as well, and that's fine. But as far as the other things, a lot of it is custom development here. App indexing requires some development work. Omnichannel, definitely anytime that you want to do the same content in multiple platforms, that's a custom development project. And then because you have to create the front end for each platform separately. So we have separate teams for iOS, Android, web, and then we've also had projects on other platforms. Like I think in the past there's been some Windows, some BlackBerry, some enterprise specific platforms that people use for like logistics applications and things like that. So those all have to be coded separately by separate teams, but they're working together to collaborate and make sure that the experience is as similar as it can be across platforms. And a lot of that consistency is the job of our design team. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. What it actually, and it does, but it also raises the question of like, what's the, you mentioned there's about 15 people on the design team. How many developers are there? And it must be huge, right?
Yeah. I mean, it might be over 100. I mean, the majority, honestly, I think a majority of the people here are developers.
Okay, so more than 100, yeah.
Yeah, because of the technical, lift of translating that design to actual implementation platform. It's a lot.
Hi everyone. We've figured out our technical issues. We had a little internet thing, which is not unusual in this day and age. So the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, Melanie, is the work you've done in educating people and helping them get into the field of content strategy. Can you tell me a little bit about how you came to do that and what you've done in that area?
Yeah. So when I came to content strategy, I was super into it. I thought it was really cool and fun because I'd been trying to solve problems as a writer, as a technical writer, that I didn't realize there was a whole community of people already working on solving these problems. And so when I found it, I was like, this is amazing. So a couple years back, when General Assembly came to Austin, Texas, when I was living there, I asked them if they'd be interested in doing a content strategy course, just sort of an intro level. And they were, and it got a great reception. People seemed to be really interested in it. And my friends who lived in other towns were like, oh, cool, is it online? And I was like, no, but I'm sure there's something online. And so I looked, and I really couldn't find anything. I found a lot of courses on content marketing. So on Udemy, you can go there and learn about SEO and content marketing, but I didn't really see anything about UX content strategy or product content strategy. So I thought, well, I already have this course that I made for General Assembly, so I'll just go ahead and convert it to an online course. And so I went ahead and did that. And I also made an introductory email series, which is free, that people can sign up for at my website, which is prosekiln.com. It's prosekiln.com, which is a really weird name. But that you can sign up for free for the email series. And then there's also a link to the paid course, which is essentially the General Assembly course, but I added in some more things and updated it. So hopefully, I've had a few people go through, and I think it's been helpful to sort of get people acquainted with what is content strategy and what are the different activities and methods that we use to think about content holistically. So that's the whole goal of that.
Got it. In terms of helping people get into the field, can you talk a little bit about the scope of what people can do? Because you've talked about, and a lot of people have talked about this, that there's both front end and back end content strategists, and the preparation for each of those is a little bit different. Do you talk about that?
Yeah, I do, especially in the introductory email series, because I feel like there's a ton of confusion out there. I just saw on Twitter last week someone was looking for a content strategy job, and they were looking at content strategist job listing, and it said, if you love marketing, and he was like, nope, because so many content strategy jobs that are called content strategist are specific to content marketing, and so that's pretty unhelpful if you're interested in another type. So the way I see it, there are a few different subtypes. We can break it down into front end and back end. So front end would be, and there's a great article that actually the Content Marketing Institute put out that I'm sure you've read about front end versus back end content strategists. So yeah, that's really helpful. And it talks about the front end being more of what I would call, not to throw more terms out there, but I think a helpful term is content design. So designing content for the user experience. And that includes writing, but it also includes things like navigation and accessibility and voice and tone and that type of stuff. And then the back-end content strategy, which is modeling content for the content management system for reuse across platforms. So configuring those headless content management systems that we talked about earlier. And then I think of content marketing as almost another area that you could put under content strategy that's specific to marketing channels. So a lot of it is dealing with the audience before their customer. So trying to drive awareness, trying to help with consideration and purchase, or whatever conversion would be for your organization. If it's a nonprofit, it might be something else, but it's early on in the process. So it's kind of ironic because I was talking about how it's all one user experience and we don't need to silo it off. But when you're going to look for a job, it is kind of helpful to know about the different parts of the user journey that you can help influence as a content strategist. And I think understanding those different roles, even though they may overlap, is helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally get that. And it's like going into any field. You want to understand the terrain before you go in there. Hey, one thing that I'm curious about, I don't have a super strong feel for this yet, but where do you think most content strategists are? Are they in consulting firms, in agencies, doing in-house stuff? Do you have a feel for that?
That's such a good question. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that before, and I've never really thought about it. But when I talk to people who are interested in this field, a lot of them are in-house, and a lot of them don't have the title of content strategist. So they might be a copywriter, they might be a tech writer, or even a developer. We have a really senior developer here who has a very sophisticated view of back-end content strategy and has done tasks that you could label as content strategist tasks. So, I mean, honestly, I almost think that the person with the job title of content strategist is less common than the person who's actually doing the work of a content strategist but isn't labeled as a content strategist, if that makes any sense.
That makes complete sense. And in fact, that's the whole reason I started this podcast, is like, what the heck are people because
Right.
I recently rebranded. I've always been a publisher, but that is for the last 20 years has entailed like building. I feel like a cranky old man. 22 years ago when I started this, you had to build your own CMS, so I became a web developer, but I've always been a publisher at heart. But when you try to tell people what a publisher is nowadays, they just kind of roll their eyes and they think, oh, you do books, or so I both gave up on that. But also, as I looked into content strategy, as like Christina Halverson or people like that would describe it, it pretty much describes my skill set and what I'm interested in. But I think I think I'm a little further along the path. But I think all of what we just talked about is super helpful for getting people who are new to the field kind of oriented and figuring out what's going on there. Hey, one last thing about preparing to get into this. You mentioned Christina Halverson's book. I saw you refer to Sarah Wachter-Boettcher's book, The Content Everywhere, in another place. Are there other sources, books, websites, experts you consult that you like?
Yeah, there are so many. I could just like list a million. I think Jonathan Coleman from Facebook has a list of like over 100 content strategy resources he recommends, which is amazing. For me, in order to not overwhelm people, I put together a blog post on my website, which I mentioned earlier, which is the post is called it's like the ultimate guide to becoming a content strategist or something. And I go through like, okay, here's what I would do. Well, here's what I did, and here's what I'd recommend you do if you want to be a content strategist. And I talk about the people to follow and the books to read. And I think I kind of narrowed it down to 4. One is Christina Halverson. One is Richard Sheffield's The Content Strategist Bible, which might be a little bit dated at this point, but for me, when I was a tech writer, it was super helpful to understand. It was also it has a very supportive tone. So his tone is like, you're a writer now. You can totally do this job of content strategist, and here's how you would do it. And for me, that was perfect. That was exactly what I needed. And then also Margot Bloomstein, she wrote a book called Contents. I'm trying to think if I'm thinking the right title. Content Strategy at Work. And then, she has a ton of really helpful, like activities and tasks and ways to approach problems in there. And similarly, Megan Casey's Content Strategist Toolkit, it's nothing but just a ton of tools that you can use in your job. And I found that to be so helpful. So those are the 4 that I would start with in order to not just dump a ton of books on it. But honestly, every year people are coming out with brilliant, awesome takes on, how to solve content problems. And it's really cool. It's a really exciting field to be a part of, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting how quickly it's growing, and like you said, the volume and number of good resources out there, and I'll link to all that stuff we just talked about in the show notes for people who want to follow up on that. Well, thanks so much, Melanie. And let me ask you one thing while you have the ear of my audience. Is there anything we haven't talked about or that's been on your mind about content strategy that you'd like to share with my folks?
I think the main thing is my sort of curiosity about people's view of content for native mobile apps that we talked about earlier. So if people have ideas, thoughts, suggestions, or questions about that, I'd love to know about that. And they can, hit me up on Twitter, or the Facebook group that you mentioned is a really good place for that. But yeah, that's my main concern. And then lately I've been thinking more about voice and how content strategy works for chat and for voice. And so that's a totally different conversation.
No, and we talked about that a little bit as we were preparing for this, because I talked to both Dwayne Forrester and Eric Enga and some other folks about the importance of voice and the convergence of voice and mobile. That's huge. And you're right, that's a whole other. So maybe I'll convene a panel. Anyhow, I'm going to explore that more. So maybe we'll have a chance to talk more about that in the future.
Yeah, please do, because I'm going to subscribe and I'm going to listen to that episode for sure.
Sweet. Thanks so much. Well, thanks so much, Melanie. It's been great having you on, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Thank you, Larry. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another content strategy interview.